Welcome to Reimagine Work, a podcast dedicated to questioning our modern conception of work and its role in our lives. I'm your host, Paul Millard, and I have conversations with philosophers, authors, creators, freelancers, and vagabonds who are trying to make sense of this question in their own lives. Join me while I try to navigate the emerging future of work. If you'd like to read more of my writing, explore this podcast, or find ways to work with me, you can go to think-boundless.com. Today, I'm talking with Amir Salihefendić, founder and CEO of Doist, a fully distributed remote company that creates productivity tools, Todoist and Twist. We'll dive into his fascinating story, moving from Bosnia to Denmark as a child, and how he started his remote company while in college and the thinking around how he runs that company. Welcome to the podcast, Amir.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you today. I think you have a lot of great ideas around what I'm seeing as emerging as potentially something that could really break through, I think, in 2020. Just the idea of remote work and what it unlocks for people. But I wanted to start with just a little bit more about who you are. So I'd love to hear more about who was the Amir that arrived in Denmark when your family emigrated there as a child?
Yeah, that's a good question. And something that I think is very critical to understand is kind of like I was a refugee. So, we didn't really migrate because we wanted to. We were forced to do this because of the Bosnian War. So basically my family lost everything in the war, and we had to kind of start from scratch. So I think it was kind of very traumatic experience. I don't actually recall much of it, the early childhood and stuff. And maybe my brain has also just blocked this off.
Right.
So it was pretty tough, but honestly, I think for me as a child, I didn't really understand much of it because I came to Denmark as 5 or 6 year old. And you don't really have, the full understanding of the situation. And I think maybe this was a much harder hit for my brother and sister and my parents than actually me. But yeah, I grew up in Denmark, and I was actually the only foreigner in the whole school.
Wow.
And I also started attending a real Danish schools in the 4th grade. So basically, I didn't have any kindergarten or the first couple of years. It was just a school, kind of made up school at the refugee camp. School was also very tough, and also I couldn't really speak the language properly. I think that was probably also a very traumatic experience, but. I got accepted very well, and I never actually got mobbed by the others, or so the people were very nice to me usually. But still, I kind of felt I didn't fit in, and that is basically the early life story of mine.
Are there any stories or moments that kind of stand out from going to school in Denmark and growing up there that maybe looking back shaped you a bit?
Something to note is I started school very late, and then also, combined with having very bad self-discipline and really being mostly interested in computers, I was a really, really bad student. And also my parents had some very tough jobs, a very tough job of running a grocery store. So they work almost all the time, and they couldn't really assist me in the schoolwork. So I struggled a lot, and the teachers actually thought I was pretty, delayed and probably maybe also not that intelligent. So I had like a special, I attend like special classes for some time. Yeah. And it's actually only like when I started to attend like the second year of high school that I actually really got up to speed with others, and then kind of accelerated from there. But yeah, that is probably like the situation I recall the most from that time.
I think in reading your story and listening to some other podcasts, so I wanted to try and interview you, ask you questions you haven't been asked before. There's a lot out there about you. But one thing that really stands out is you're able to, over and over again, not follow the conventional wisdom. I'm wondering where you think that comes from, because I think it's both enabled you to build a pretty impressive remote company and just do a remote company, which when you were founding it wasn't the norm.
Yeah, that's a good question, Paul. And I mean, maybe it's kind of like this upbringing and like feeling like an outsider and like not really like following the standard path. Like nothing that I have done has actually been very standard. And that combined maybe also like with first principles thinking that I got also inspired by some time ago. I think that is probably like the combination that makes that possible. This said, I do actually like read a lot, and I get inspired a lot by others. I just don't blindly go where others go. So, for instance, like early on, I was kind of inspired by like the Basecamp folks, who I think have done like a pretty good job. But I just don't blindly follow what they are like preaching, and I also try to look at things like from a different perspective. So, for instance, like we are fully bootstrapped, but I don't really see like VC pad as like the evil pad, and like VCs as destroying like societies and stuff like that. I mean, the narrative that some people bring into it. Yeah. So I think that's hard to know like how this got created. But the thing is, like, I always actually try to look at things from like different radical perspectives, and then I try to like create my own conclusion on things. So for instance, like instead of just being like VC is the only path forward, or like bootstrapping is the only path forward, I kind of like try to see like what are the different radicals preaching, and what is like the middle ground here.
Yeah, that's harder than it seems. I think just because the pressure of founding a company is so high, so many people just want to do what everyone else is doing just to be safe. I'm wondering like how you actually go through that process. So for example, you have no outside investment, no plans to exit, right? So somewhat similar to Basecamp. They do have outside investment, but I don't think they have any voting rights on the shares. How did you was it just web research, talking to people? How do you arrive at that view?
First of all, like I had some experience with the VC path, and I didn't really like it that much. That's how I kind of arrived to this. That like my last company was actually like VC backed without any like real business model, and I didn't like this at all. So that's how I arrived at the current situation. But also something to know is like I wouldn't actually oppose getting funding at some point, or even like exiting. And I think like exit is kind of like it needs to be understood in the context that I don't really want to stop what I'm doing. But for instance, like becoming a public company, that's kind of like an exit, but it's kind of like an exit that doesn't really end your journey, especially like if you're smart and do it smartly. So, I mean, just to give you like a bit of overview on these things. So like, I think even like my perspective is kind of very balanced, and I'm not really like a very radical person that opposes anything.
Yeah, it sounds like you try to look for the radical ideas to kind of figure out where the middle ground is and the reasonable solution.
Exactly. And honestly, Wait But Why, I'm not sure if you know that blog, but it's an amazing blog.
Yeah, definitely.
And one of the recent articles he has is basically like the human, mind and how we actually operate. And I think like presenting black and white things and radical ideas is actually the easy path forward, because we are kind of like very tribal by nature. So you can see this like in politics and stuff like that. And what I have actually learned is like maybe to tone this down and like maybe try to find the middle ground and look at things from different perspectives instead of like painting the world as like black versus white. And I think if you see this around, like even I think like we can go back to Basecamp. There's like no gray areas. Like it's very bombastic and it works really, really well, this kind of communication. That's why they do it. But it also like is a very, I think, dangerous way, because most of things are kind of like balanced, and you need to find like a middle way in almost any situation, and not just like go from black to white or like do like propaganda aspects of like an idea or a movement.
Yeah, and it seems the nuance aspect is such a core part of so many of the remote companies I talk to. What a lot of people seem to realize is as soon as you hire those first remote employees, you have to actually write down and put down what are the processes, what are the culture, what are the beliefs, what are the trade-offs. And it's actually a lot harder than people imagine, mostly because the model for work is in-person communication, where a lot of these things are kind of picked up through practice rather than figuring out what they are. We could dive into a lot on remote working, but what are some of the other big shifts you've seen from just starting a remote company versus others?
In what sense, like shifts in working together, or like?
Yeah, so one of the big shifts I've seen is that it actually shifts the focus from work as the center of life and then designing your life around it with commutes, cars, everything, to shifting more of what is the life you're living and then designing the work around it. Maybe you could reflect on that shift, or if there are other shifts you've seen that have really been powerful from remote work.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I look at it is kind of like it's a very radical way, actually, and maybe not everybody will agree, but I see this like as a new industrialization, because it's actually like the first time in human history that you can actually get an amazing job regardless of where you live. So you're not really like location bound anymore. And I think this has like huge amounts of implications to everything. So like you said, like you can design your life as you like. And if you actually also like are both accepting like location independence and also time independence, then you can, do work from almost anywhere, and you can structure your day as you like, and you can still, be productive and do amazing things. And I think this is actually the first time in history where this is actually possible. At least do it that like in a high scale way. So for me, that would be like a huge implication that has like all kinds of consequences. And maybe like some of the consequences that isn't talked about that much is basically like, making this accessible to almost anybody on Earth. While like the old system, like you had to live like in London, or like San Francisco to actually get like a tech job. Right now you can do that from like Africa or whatever.
Right.
So I'm quite excited of actually how this affects not only work, but also life and like people around the world.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And I think it is also a trend that scares people a bit, because if you play out the implications, so I'm actually located in Taiwan and grew up in the US. And if you suddenly can hire globally, you have to quickly do the math that some very, very talented engineer in Taiwan, and there are tons of them, is probably willing to work for far less of a salary than somebody in the US or other high-cost regions. So it becomes a lot more competitive. So I think people that are willing to be location independent might have a lot more options, but it's also pretty threatening to people who have relied on full-time work in their local economies.
I mean, that is definitely true, but I think this would kind of be like a gain. Yeah. And the reason is, I think also like salaries, as I see it, and also like as we see it evolve, will kind of become global in this space. So yeah, like already now, if you look at like the top remote companies, location is kind of like maybe a small factor into the salary formula. It's not like the deciding factor like it is for regular companies. And this actually has like huge amounts of implications, I think, also to societies in like at least like in the future, where like a person, and we have this already right now inside our company, like they gain maybe like 10x of what they would actually gain locally.
Wow.
And this has all kinds of implications, for like their families, and like they can, be a great help in their local communities. And if you have like a lot of these people, I think this will kind of start a trend, and then like this path of like actually getting like this kind of job will become much more popular.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty powerful. I'd love to hear, so how are you actually thinking about compensation? Do you just start with some of the most competitive markets right now and orient around that? Because it's actually counter to what I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of like a huge debate, and there's many ways you can actually look at this. I can tell you like how we look at this, and how our like formula is. So basically, we actually use like the US market as the benchmark currently. And I think like I'm not sure like what percentile we are looking at, but it's like, I don't know, over 75% percentile that we look at, and then we base like the core salaries on that. And actually, like the US market is by far like the most expensive market to hire from. So that's basically how we do it. And I think like a lot of other remote companies do a similar thing. Because like for these tech companies, what you actually care about is like hiring very talented people, and you don't really care about like cost minimization or like paying as little as possible. Because like a great designer, a great engineer, support person, or like marketing person can, bring in a lot more than you actually pay them. Yeah, so that's at least how we look at this. And in our salary formula, location has like a 30% or can have like a 30% effect on the core salary that you get. And as I see it, like as we evolve, we actually want to pay higher and higher salaries. So actually, like we have done like significant salary raises of I think at least like 10% the last like 8 or 9 years. So that's a bit about our salaries and how we think about it.
Yeah, and it seems like remote work is at the core of this shift towards, and I think we'll talk about this in a bit, it makes work a little more asynchronous, right? So you can't track and control people. I was actually watching one of the Q&As you did at a conference, and somebody asked a question which kind of cracked me up a bit, which was, how do you know if your remote workers are working? Like that would be a good question in any company, but we have this idea that we kind of need to control and monitor people, right? And it seems that remote work is really at the center of a shift from this built-in paradigm of you go to work for X number of hours to, all right, let's do great work. Does that resonate with how you're thinking about it?
It does. And I mean, I think that's spot on, and something that we don't do, like we don't track people. We don't actually know how much time they are spending, and we don't really care about this. I think like what you really need to track is kind of the output, like what are people actually contributing with, and not, like the input is like hours. I think especially like in our work that's like highly creative, you can kind of like go for like a 2-hour walk and do a lot of work and like solve really hard problems. And maybe in a normal company, this wouldn't really be considered hard work, because you're just like walking, and you're not really at your desk. So I think this shift is happening, and I honestly don't only think this is happening like for remote companies, but like just like work in general, like, with so much leverage that you have, like as a tech worker, and so much creativity, like it becomes actually much more critical, like the solutions they come with, than like the amounts of time you spend on this.
How do you think about training? I think one thing I did consulting in my past career. I do freelance consulting now. And one thing I challenge executives on is, tell me what your first week of training is about, right? And a lot of them will tell me it's about policies, procedures, and all these things. And I say, well, where's the training on like how to do great work, how to learn, all these meta skills? Do you help people think about developing these skills, like even things that might be out of your domain, like sleep, health, doing deep work, learning how to learn?
I mean, this is kind of like the core at what we do at Doist, and what we actually want to promote is kind of like, constant learning and constant growth of like the people that are inside the company. And inside like this space as well, like if you actually stop learning, like first of all, like this is a bad thing for the organization, because a lot of stuff, like the markets are moving so fast and the technologies are moving so fast that, in some years, like you will not be able to do any kind of like meaningful contributions. And then also for the individual, like they will actually be hard pressed to actually find a job again if their skills stall. So let's say that, like you have invested all your time in just like learning jQuery and you stopped at that. And then, like a few years in, you have like a lot of other technologies, such as like React or Redux or whatever. And if you actually don't really evolve your skill set, then like finding a job doing jQuery right now will probably be very tough, as I would imagine. And I think this happens like almost all kind of things, like design as well, or like product work, and even maybe marketing, and even maybe like the leadership positions. Like if you still think the right way to do stuff is kind of to track people and to kind of like look at how many code lines they have committed, then you're kind of like very outdated, and it will probably not be a very good way to succeed for the future. So that's kind of like how we and I look at this.
Yeah. Do you and your team talk about doing deep work and what that actually means?
Oh, I mean, we have huge threads about like how to do better work, how to do deep work. So I think that's kind of like a core thing that we actually do inside Doist.
And so a short question here. One thing that jumped out is you give people 40 vacation days. Do people really take all 40 vacation days?
I mean, they do. That's
awesome.
And it's kind of like forced. I mean, the thing is like, you could actually do like unlimited vacation days. It doesn't really work that well, like if you actually look at the data, because you kind of like need to force people to do this, and then it also needs to like be everybody inside the company that does this. So if I, for example, only take like 5 days of vacation per year, it sends like a very bad signal to the rest of the company.
Another thing I've noticed about remote work is that it has this unintended side effect of just letting people breathe a little, letting them be a little more human. I think on your site, you have a couple articles where you talk about parents and how they're just able to kind of embrace a little of the chaos that comes with that, letting their kids sit in on the video chats or even bringing their family to the retreats. How is that intentional? How you think about kind of including the broader aspects of people's lives? It just seems that remote work really enables kind of breaking past that, like, I need to be in professional mode all the time mindset.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think like something that's underrated for remote work, it's kind of like it's much more compatible with parenting because you kind of have like much more flexibility. And I think it's also much actually better for instance, for women, especially with like longer maternity leave, and also just like that they can kind of like structure the days so they can still actually do some work, but also like, they can be with their babies and stuff. And of course for fathers as well. I mean, I have like a small daughter of like 2 weeks now, and it's quite great to just like be able to, like do an extra hour in the morning with her, or like, go home and work from home and be with her without really affecting my work that much. So I think like for parents, this is like a huge benefit, and for families as well. And maybe this is like underappreciated right now.
Have you talked to a lot of other companies who might not be remote yet, but are thinking about making the transition and seeking you out for advice?
Oh, I have talked with a lot of those. Yeah, it's a very common theme.
What are some of the like common thoughts of resistance that they give you, and how do you help them reframe some of those things? I think just the one around like, well, how do I keep track of what my people are doing? We kind of touched that on a bit, but what are some of the common pushbacks that other founders or CEOs give you about remote work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think something that's like really tough to do is like kind of change. Let's say that you actually have 20 people working from an office, and then suddenly like you go in and like go remote all the way. I think that's probably a very, very hard change to do, because like remote work, especially like as we do it, like, remote first, like there's no office, no work times and stuff like that. That's a really like huge paradigm shift and cultural shift. And I think just like jumping in and doing this, that is not something that I recommend. So what I would actually recommend is like maybe, do like remote 1 day per week, or like 2 days per week, and then like upgrade it gradually instead of like just like taking like a huge jump into the unknown. And yeah, so that's one thing. And the other thing is basically like that you actually need to come up with like whole new ways to communicate, to document stuff. Because you just can't go over and like tap somebody on the shoulder. You don't really see people. I mean, it's kind of like it has huge amounts of implications, and maybe actually changing the current companies to work fully remotely. I'm actually unsure if that is a good idea or that works that well. Like maybe what you need to do is like create a new company where you like build stuff from scratch, and where you actually hire people for that kind of like mindset, because also like remote work isn't for everybody. And some people don't really like it, and some people are not very good at these positions, because like you have to have a lot of like independence. You have to kind of be self-managed, self-motivated. There's also like huge amounts of like social implications on this. So I would say that it's kind of a paradigm shift, and like normal companies, I doubt they can actually convert that easily to this new paradigm.
Yeah, that's the feeling I get too. I just think the kind of embedded beliefs are just so hard to overcome. But it seems you'd have to be at least smaller, or at least somewhat mobile or technology based already.
Yeah, I mean, something that I see that is maybe going to be a trend is like the way that Stripe is kind of like doing this. Like they are basically creating like a internal remote team of like 100 or 150 people that are just going to be run by like the remote first principles. And that is also a way you can do it, is like maybe, like you're creating like an iOS team, like maybe make that remote first and try that out first, and instead of like moving everybody over to this new paradigm.
So Doist has two pieces of software. The first one was a to-do list productivity app called Todoist, and the second one was Twist. I'd love to dive into Twist, which is a asynchronous chat. So that just means whenever you're sending messages, it doesn't mean it's real-time communication. You're going to be receiving it at a later date, or there are certain times you can check in on the communication. How did that tool arise? Was that something you built internally for your team at first?
Yeah, I mean, actually, like the way that we do product development is we build stuff for ourselves. So that's the secret. And Twist is the same. It's kind of like we actually were using Slack at the beginning, but we could see like huge amounts of issues with Slack and the way that it was designed, and the way that it worked, that really didn't resemble the way that we wanted to work. So that's how we actually came up with this tool, and where, especially like as a remote first company, like asynchronicity is very important if you actually want to scale across time zones. But it's also actually very critical for like deep work, because in Twist, the messages aren't only like one-liners. They are more like emails, so like emails type of messages you send around. So those are the two things and the history of the product.
Yeah. Do you teach people certain ways of writing or help them develop those skills just to communicate clearer?
I mean, something also to note is, you can kind of like design software in different ways that promote different type of interactions. So if you look at like the Slacks or like chat apps in general, the way they are designed is kind of like for these quick liners.
Yeah, just send whatever you're thinking.
Exactly. And like it's basically like one line thinking all the way through, and that's what they promote. And what we actually want to promote is kind of like thoughtful and deep communication. So that's what we actually built around the app for. It's basically like it promotes that kind of interaction. And you can see that people actually do this because the software kind of like promotes this. That's the default that people actually do. So like on Twist, you don't just send like one-liners. You actually try to create like thoughtful content and share that with others.
Yeah, it seems like Slack solved the real problem when it was emerging. It made people realize, we should actually like categorize, sort, make things searchable. But then it seems people also realize a couple of years later, wait, I'm spending all my time just slacking rather than, it's kind of funny, it's named Slack, but slacking rather than actually doing the work. How have you had a lot of reaction or interest in your app recently because of this?
I mean, honestly, like for us, this is kind of like a battle, and we are kind of like a radical in this way of thinking, and the market itself, they have not really like figured this out, that it's actually like real-time chat communication and one-line thinking isn't like the way to go. So we do have like some interest in this, but I would also say that it's not kind of like we don't really have like product market fit, because the market doesn't really value this that much right now. We hope, of course, like this changes, but it's kind of like fighting, against like the human nature, because the thing to note is like real-time communication and chat with emojis and stuff. Like it's really, really fun and addictive. So when you actually remove this from users, they actually feel like, you have like really removed something great away from them.
Yeah, taking away those dopamine hits.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like, imagine like if you had just like free cocaine and it didn't really have like amounts of like negative aspects. That's basically like Slack. And then you try to kind of tell people that maybe like cocaine all the time isn't that good.
So you're offering the spinach instead of the cocaine.
Exactly. And like and it's hard, to kind of like promote this kind of mindset, because it's the only thing you can see like long term. So what I actually hope is like the work that we do at Doist on, for instance, like Todoist and even Twist itself, kind of speaks for itself of like the effectiveness of this method.
Yeah, and it's almost like the product market fit for you might be the market that's emerging of the remote companies to be created, who are starting and saying, okay, Slack doesn't look perfect. How do we actually do something from the start that's a little bit different?
Yeah, but honestly, like we are not really seeing that. Like even like the remote companies, they just say, okay, like being online all the time and chit-chatting all day long, that's perfectly fine. Like, and that's what they do. Like, and there's very few that actually go in and challenge the status quo and like challenge, this line of thinking. And yeah, so unfortunately, like I don't really think like people have woken up yet to this fact. And maybe, we are also wrong. That could also be an option. And like this asynchronous model is kind of the wrong model of the future. It's very hard to know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, hopefully I can spread the word a little, but you hear from individuals that they're frustrated with this. But I think, like you said, it's just so addictive and so rewarding to people that it's just going to be hard to change those behaviors.
Yeah. And I mean, also like if you look at who actually designed like this model, like it's a gaming company.
I did not know that.
Like their first product was a game. Oh yeah, like they pivoted away from a game to Slack.
Wow, that's a great fun fact.
So that kind of also tells you a bit like what kind of elements are used to kind of like create a product like that.
I'm really energized by companies like yours who really seem to be giving power back to individuals, but in the same sense, you're really aligning with unleashing kind of people's creative potential, their freedom to live the lives as they please. What advice would you give people that are either in traditional organizations or other remote companies for some of the things you guys have done really well that you wish more people knew about?
I mean, that's a good question, Paul. I think definitely like asynchronous communication and lifestyle is kind of a huge part. And I really hope like people actually take this more seriously. So that's one aspect. Another aspect, and it's like maybe Todoist related, it's kind of like that most people just wing things and they don't really have like the personal productivity system where they can actually like, plan their days, execute their days, and have a prioritization of like the stuff that they actually want to spend time on. and plan that and execute that. And for me personally, like that's kind of like the mission that we are on, is kind of like enabling like better communication, but also like better organization, because I think that can really like unlock like a ton of human potential.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to hear what influence Denmark has had on your mindset around work. So I did some work in Denmark and Copenhagen for a bit, and I'm forgetting the word now, but my colleagues introduced me to this word that's something to do with work-life integration, or just bringing joy to kind of all aspects of your life. Totally forget what the word is, but it was one of these untranslatable words and ideas that seemed to really be embraced and led to a lot different perspectives than some of the American offices I was working in at the time.
I mean, honestly, like I think the stuff that Scandinavia does is really, really well, and it's not like only Denmark, but also like Norway and Sweden and Finland. So I think like a lot of other countries could actually, and people could get inspired by that, because in Denmark, like you actually don't really work all the time. I think like the standard work week is 37 hours. And the thing to note about that is kind of like they work those hours, but it's like really, really efficient, and there's like no fooling around. And that's something that really impressed me a lot, because in a lot of other cultures, like maybe people work like 50 hours, but most of that work is kind of like very unfocused, and it's like very, it's not very efficient. So that's one aspect. And I think the word that you're probably looking at is maybe hygge. I'm unsure, but...
yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, that's kind of like it's very hard, like it's hard to translate it, but it's kind of like that you're just enjoying the little stuff and like the moment, the atmosphere. And you usually do that with other people, people that you care about. But you can also do it like solo, like you can actually like, create a cup of coffee and like just, do some coding, and then that is kind of like a great moment. The society really like celebrates those kind of moments and tries to kind of optimize towards that. So like the whole way that you actually structure, like, for instance, like Christmas is upcoming, and I think like some of the nicest like Christmas decorations can be found like in Denmark. And it kind of creates this atmosphere, and then it's much easier to kind of get into the mood of like, spending time with your family, and like, like with a hot cup of cacao or something like that, and enjoying the moment. Yeah.
Wow. I love that. Where would you like to point people if they want to learn more about your apps, Twist or Todoist, or just more about your writing on running a remote company?
Yeah, honestly, like the thing with us is like we share a ton of stuff with people. So we have a blog called Balance and Ambition on doist.com. You can access it from there. And we have basically like, shared a ton over the years. We also have like a remote work academy where we have basically like collected the best tips from us and from also some of the other companies, such as like Buffer, and created guides of various different things that are remote work related. So those are, I think, the best like resources we have. And then I also like tweet, maybe not a lot, but I tweet sometimes on Amix3K. So yeah, you can also like follow me there, and like I usually post stuff about work and like productivity, deep work. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it was a pleasure to talk to you today, Amir. I wish you continued luck with the company, and appreciate the work you're doing.
Paul, it was a pleasure speaking with you, and thanks a lot for having me here. I hope people will find this enjoyable.
Thanks for listening to Reimagine Work. I'm having a ton of fun doing this podcast. One friend even reached out and said it's like a really professional coffee chat conversation from business school. I'm not sure what to make of that, but I'm going to put that one in the positive column for now. If you have feedback for me similar to that, I'd love to hear it. Shoot me a note, reach out, message me on Twitter. And if you want to support the podcast, you know how to do it. Go to iTunes, you can give it a rating, you can share it with a friend. And if you want to offer a financial contribution or gift, you can do that in the link in the podcast. Thanks for listening and have a good week.